Hello, everyone. My name is Angel, and I serve here as one of the pastors. And today we continue our sermon series that we went ahead and a few months ago we asked the church, hey, go ahead and present some questions to the church, to church leadership. And we're going to turn all those questions into a summer series. And you guys went ahead and presented some very controversial questions. So thank you very much for these hard-hitting things that you guys threw at us. And today we are going to be looking at a very challenging question that many of us may have or many of us don't have. And then when I bring it up, I'll be like, yeah, you know what? I do want to know about that. And that's the question of what's the whole big thing with Israel? Why is Israel always in the news? Why is Israel such a big deal? And so that's going to be what we're focusing our attention on today. And so if you have a Bible, open it to Hebrews chapter 11. Because in Hebrews chapter 11, we see this story documented that is extremely important for us to understand. And we're going to look at a very big part of Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to look at from verses 8 all the way down to verse 20. It's a very big section. And I'm going to read it all, and it's going to feel very daunting and like, man, is he still going? And it's going to be like, yes, I'm still going, because we're going to read a very large section that there's one major point that has to be understood from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 to 20. That's very significant, not just for the topic of the question of why is Israel so important, but even for this major point that we're going to be addressing at the close of this sermon. And so let me go ahead and read this for us, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 to 20. Look at what it says. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past of age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, was born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand in the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them, and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. Verse 14, for people who speak thus make it clear, that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Verse 17, look at this. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, for which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Last verse, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Now, what I just read is documentation in the New Testament, final documentation in the New Testament of one of the most fundamental stories of the Old Testament. This story here is massively documented throughout the entire Old Testament, and there's one idea I want you to keep in mind, maybe even write it down, of when what we just read was written. Because what we just read was written anywhere from the time of 45 to 70 AD. That's 45 to 70 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. And that one point is extremely significant for what we're going to look at the end. Now, this idea of what we see here in this story, it showcases for us what the people believed about Abraham so close to the times of Jesus. And what we need to understand is that this story, it's very documented throughout Genesis, all the way from Genesis chapter 12 all the way to Genesis chapter 25, that's where you find the story. So much real estate is given in Genesis to this one specific story that we just read from Hebrews. But just for the sake of time, let me just give you a summary of the story. See, we have this gentleman. His name is Abraham. Abraham is a very big deal, not just in the Bible, but in the history of the world. See, Abraham was a pagan man. His father was a pagan. He came from a pagan family, meaning that he was not somebody who was considering and following Yahweh. But yet, God chose Abraham. God pursued Abraham. God predestined him, elected him for a great purpose that Abraham wasn't even looking for. And God tells Abraham to leave his father, to leave his mother, and to go ahead and pursue this land that God was going to show him. It's a very unique story and what takes place in there, but there's very specific promises that are made to Abraham. And these promises have to be understood to answer the question of what's taking place in the Middle East even to this day. See, this one promise had three different components to it. And the first component to this promise was that there was going to be a land given to Abraham. The promise that Abraham was going to receive a land. And the promise wasn't just for Abraham himself to receive a land. It was for his descendants to receive this land as well. But what's significant about the land that is promised to Abraham today, that's the land of Israel today. That land has been fought over for over 4,000 years. That land has been fought and over. And throughout this Bible, that land is spoken of as the promised land, which many of us might be familiar with that idea of the promised land. And throughout the Old Testament, there's over 2,000 different references to the promised land. And then in the New Testament, there's over 700 mentions of the promised land. So if you combine from front cover of the Bible to the end of the Bible, there's over 2,700 different mentions of the promised land. And that's a big deal for what we're going to be talking about towards the end of the sermon. But not only was he promised this land, but he was also promised that he was going to have a nation that would come from him. And that is significant because what was being promised to him, that from Abraham, his offspring would multiply so much that there will be so many of them that it's almost like the stars in the sky or even like the grains of sand on the seashore. And the reason why that's a big deal of a promise is because at the point when Abraham was receiving this, he was of old age, and so was his wife. But not only was his wife of old age, close to 80 years old, she was also barren, unable to give birth to a child. So here you have these people receiving a promise of an offspring, but yet they're in their 80s and they've never had a child before. But not only was he told that there was going to be an offspring that would come from him, so grand that you couldn't even count, so big it was like the stars in the sky, so much as like the grains of sand in a seashore. But then on top of that, that from this offspring, from this nation, would come a blessing. And the blessing that would come from this nation is very specific and very important for us to understand. And that blessing is talked about all throughout the story of Abraham in Genesis. It comes up in dozens of different ways. But for those of you who are writing notes, there's two specific references that I want you to write down and maybe read later. That's Genesis chapter 18, verses 17 to 18, and Genesis chapter 22, verses 17 to 18. They're very similar in their references and similar in what they're talking about, the specific blessing. See, the blessing that God was telling Abraham was that through his offspring would come the one who would redeem, would come the one who would restore, would come the one who brings peace between God and humanity. And that, by scholars, is known as the Abrahamic covenant. That through Abraham's offspring would come the one who is the Messiah. And this Messiah would be born in this land. And he will come from this land, from this nation, and be a blessing to the nations, to the world. And that's very significant. Now, I know that all sounds great and nice. Like, yeah, you're on board with that. Like, ooh, I get it. Great. But because of sin, things get a little bit messy. Because of sin, things get a little bit complicated. And so this brings in Sarah Abraham's beautiful wife. And Abraham's beautiful wife, she struggled with this promise that Abraham was given, that he would one day receive a land, that he will one day receive a promise. And you have to understand too, wrapped into all of this whole idea of Sarah's story, this whole idea of Abraham's story, is that you have to always remember that from the beginning of time in the Garden of Eden, there has always been an adversary against God's plan. There's always been an evil one, Satan, who seeks to destroy what God seeks to build. Satan, who seeks to tear down and what God seeks to establish. And throughout history, Satan has waged war on these three specific things. Who's going to get God's land? Who's going to be God's people? And who's going to be God's chosen one? Those three things come up time and time again over the thousands of years of humanity. But what we see at the most basic level of this story is that the biggest problem within this story is disobedience. Disobedience is the main problem that we're going to see, and it starts here with Sarah. See, because Sarah struggled to really believe this promise that Abraham had received. And we can judge her all we want, but the truth is, it kind of makes sense that she would struggle. It's very reasonable that she would have a hard time. Imagine, close to her 80s, never had a child, and she knows that there's supposed to be a promise for Abraham, offspring, and the blessing, all this stuff. So Sarah does something very significant. And Sarah, there's actually a lot of correlations with what Sarah does and who Sarah is with Eve in the Garden of Eden. See, because just like Eve in the Garden of Eden, Sarah struggled to believe the promise that her husband received. Sarah, like Eve in the Garden of Eden, struggled to understand and receive the word that her husband had received. Like Eve in the garden, Sarah believed that God was holding back and that she had to take matters into her own hands. And like Eve in the garden, Sarah went ahead and presented temptation to her husband. And that brings us to the temptation, the forbidden fruit of Hagar. And here we are where Sarah goes ahead and does something wild, where she had a servant girl named Hagar, who was an Egyptian, a pagan woman. And she has this servant girl. She presents her to Abraham and says, I want you to go ahead and sleep with my husband. And I want you to conceive a child so that we can force the blessing, so we can force the promise of God, and so we can bring this to fruition. She was seeking to force the hand of God because she was struggling to believe that God was going to come through, that God was holding back. Now, Hagar was a pagan young girl from Egypt, didn't believe or follow the same God, Yahweh, and she was being obedient to what she was being told to do, and she conceived with Abraham. Wild, creepy story. But she conceives with Abraham, and then while she is pregnant with Abraham, she has a visit from the angel of the Lord. And that phrase, the angel of the Lord, is significant. As we've talked about many different times in different sermons, the angel of the Lord is believed to have been Jesus, reincarnated. Jesus, before his birth, Jesus in the world, appearing in many different forms and many different ways in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord goes ahead and prophesies something very specific to Hagar about the baby that was in her belly. Look at what the angel of the Lord tells to Hagar in Genesis chapter 16, verses 11 to 12. Look what he says. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against his kinsmen. So what we see in this story, which is the next point in your handouts, you see that Hagar goes ahead and has a son and has to name him Ishmael. And what we learn about that prophecy of Ishmael is that Ishmael was to be a man who would be like a wild donkey, a man with no restraint, a man who can't be controlled, a man who's unpredictable, untamed. And she gives birth to Ishmael. And the man of Ishmael, or this prophecy about Ishmael, was not just about him. It was also about his descendants as well. as we're going to talk about towards the end of the sermon. That before all that we're going to talk about at the end of the sermon, it was prophesied that him and his offspring would be untamable people who have an issue with everybody, and everybody's got an issue with them. Now, over 13 years later, at this point, Ishmael might be 16 years old. Something very important took place. God goes ahead and fulfills the prophetic promise to Sarah and Abraham, and Sarah gives birth to Isaac. The name Isaac means laughter because it was a hilarious thing that here this woman, well into her 80s or early 90s, would give birth to a boy. And this was a ridiculous thing, but here's what you have in this moment. You've got 2 wives. Woo! Can you imagine? Woo! The conflict, the challenge. Man, that means 2 birthdays, guys, all right? 2 Valentine's gifts. That's a big deal for those of us who struggle, right? 2 wives, 2 sons, 1 Abraham. 2 wives, 2 sons, 1 promise, 1 covenant. This is a big deal. And as you can imagine, things were not smooth. Who's going to get the land? Who's going to be the promised one? Who's going to be the one that the blessing and the nation comes from? There's tremendous conflict that you can read about in the book of Genesis and find so much about it. But what's interesting that you will find in reading the story of Genesis is that Abraham clearly saw Isaac as the favored promised one. Abraham saw that this was the son who was born to fulfill the promise that God made to him. So much so that in Genesis chapter 25, as Abraham is on his deathbed, he looks to Isaac. Isaac looks to him, and Abraham goes ahead and says, Isaac, you have everything of mine. And he gives Isaac all of the inheritance. And what's interesting of that, and many of us may not know, a fun little nugget, in that very chapter of Genesis chapter 25, it tells us that Abraham also had 6 other sons, meaning he had 8 sons. But Abraham chose to bless Isaac and give him the inheritance, and to Ishmael and the other sons gave them just gifts. It was a very clear distinction throughout the story of Genesis of Abraham viewing Isaac as the promised one. But then to make things even more clear, there's one of the most complexing and just graphic stories, and one for me that's so hard to embrace and think through as a father of 3 sons, found in Genesis chapter 22. It's a story that when you really study it and look at it, you could just see it's in many ways a horror story. See, because here Abraham in Genesis chapter 22 has his promised son, his beloved son, his supernaturally born son, and God comes to Abraham and says, your beloved son who was born of a promise, your beloved son who was born of a miracle, your beloved son who was born to bless the nations, needs to be sacrificed. And God commands Abraham to sacrifice his beloved, supernaturally born, promised son. And at this time, you have to understand that Isaac was maybe 16 to 20 years old at this point. Isaac was a young man, and Ishmael was a grown man already with children. And here Abraham is being told to walk with his son to the place of sacrifice. And when you pay attention to the details, you see that Isaac was even told by Abraham for Isaac to carry the wood that he was to be sacrificed on. And he was to carry the wood that he was to be sacrificed on alongside 2 other servants. So let me retell you the story. Abraham had his beloved son who was born to an unlikely woman, born of a miracle, born to fulfill the promise, hiking to the place of his sacrifice with wood on his shoulder alongside 2 servants. All of this while being led by his father. And Isaac could have overpowered his father. His father was well into his 90s. Here's this young man, strong and capable. He could have pushed his father away and ran in disobedience, but no. Isaac surrenders and submits to his father. Isaac lays himself down, obedient to the father, lays down to be slaughtered by the father. And as Abraham holds up the knife over his son Isaac, is getting ready to stab his son Isaac. And just to help you understand the graphicness of what the sacrifice was to be, Abraham was going to stab his son, bleed out his body, and then light on fire the wood beneath him to put him ablaze and turn him to ashes as a sacrifice for sin. Horrific! And Abraham, ready to do it because of his faith, as Hebrews says, believing that God would raise him up from the grave, which is so extraordinary in itself, gets ready to stab his son and slaughter his beloved miracle child son. And as he's getting ready to bring the knife, here's from the side the angel of the Lord say, "Stop! Don't do it!" And then as Abraham looks to the side, Abraham sees a ram caught in a bush, and the ram's crown of the ram's head is caught in thorns, foreshadowing the supernatural, miraculous, true sacrifice that would one day come through the line of Abraham. Abraham calls that mountain the place where God provided. It's an amazing story. And from that moment on, the Bible records that Isaac was always treated like the promised one. That from Isaac came the nation of Israel. And Israel, as they were approaching the promised land that was made to Abraham, as they're approaching the promised land, God gives them a command. And remember, the problem of this whole story is disobedience. And God gives them a command in Numbers chapter 33, verse 50 to 54. And the command was to go into that land and to remove everyone who was there, to remove all the people who lived there. Israel was commanded by God to drive out the nations from the promised land. And that command, it also had a very strong promise attached to it. Look at the promise that God put to this. And this is really wild when you think of what the Middle East is, especially for the Israelites who have always been there. Look at this. Verse 55 of Numbers chapter 33. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall be bars in your eyes and thorns in your side, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell. And I will do to you as I thought to do to them. The Israelites, they didn't obey. And because they didn't obey, the result of their disobedience was persecution. The result was persecution. That's the final point. See, like Eve disobeyed, Sarah disobeyed. Like Sarah disobeyed, Abraham disobeyed. Like Abraham disobeyed, Moses and the people disobeyed and did not drive out the inhabitants. Their disobedience has led to a generational effect. All disobedience leads to generational effects. Now, this is the story that has been taught for thousands of years. This is a story that was taught, believed, and understood for thousands of years by millions of different people. This was a story that at the birth of Jesus was still being taught and believed. This was a story that Jesus in his ministry declared this story and even connected himself to the story. Jesus himself said that he was the offspring of Abraham that came through Isaac to bring the great promise. And then as Jesus was getting ready to descend, and he looks at his apostles in the Great Commission and says, "Go to all the nations." And what was he doing at that moment? He was referring back to the story of the blessing to all of the nations. That was the story always believed. So much so that then the apostles went out and gave their lives to writing about this story. So much so that they taught the story. So much so that in Hebrews that we read in the beginning of this, Hebrews 11, from 45 to 70 AD, that was the final documentation of this story. That from Abraham came Isaac and the promise for one day Jesus to come. But let's do something a little bit interesting. Let's fast forward in history a little bit. And let's move ahead from 40 to 70 AD to maybe about 550 years later in history. And let's see 632 AD. In 632 AD, there was a gentleman named Muhammad who was dying. And in 632 AD, at the moments of his final moments of life, he was finalizing the Quran. And Muhammad, while writing the Quran, this is what he believed. He believed an angel came to visit him. He believed an angel came to speak to him. And personally, and I honestly feel this was deep in my heart, that angel, I believe, was either a demon or Satan himself. I believe it was a fallen angel. Because the angel came and spoke to him and said to him, you need to start something. And here's what we know in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18. For those of you taking notes, write that verse down. Paul, in 40 AD, warned all Christians to us to this day, and he said, but even if an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we preach to you, let him be accused. And then in Galatians chapter 3, he goes on to explain the Abrahamic covenant and the offspring. But here we have Muhammad, over 550 years after the last New Testament documentation of the story of Abraham, saying there's something different, and a fallen angel has told him. The angel tells him that he needs to prophesy and present a new religion to the world. And the essence of Islam is that all of the Old Testament is wrong. That all of the Old Testament got it wrong. That thousands of years before, that millions of different people before, all of them got this one story wrong. And within Islam, what you see is that Hagar is the chosen one and Sarah is the rejected one. Within Islam, what you see is that Ishmael is the chosen one and Isaac is the rejected one. Within Islam, what you even see, which is so insane, that they take the story of Genesis chapter 22 and they say it wasn't Isaac who was being sacrificed, it was Ishmael who was being sacrificed. And they flip it just enough that it becomes a drastically different whole story completely altogether. And they flip it and twist it and make this thing different. And this is what's happening right now in Israel. This is why the Palestinians fight and argue for the land, because they believe what that angel told Muhammad, that Ishmael was the chosen one, not Isaac. And that's the battle. That's the war for the land, for the nation, and for the blessing. So what do we do? How do we embrace this? How do we know that it was Isaac? And how do we know that what the Bible's teaching is really what it was? Well, I think you got to look and focus on what this story is really all about. Like, who is this story really addressing? What does the story really connect us to? Who is the one that all of this is truly about, and how do we see this all fulfilled in Jesus? See, because once you understand that, you begin to see it clearly. And we will be talking more about Islam next week, but we need to address the reality of what we see in Jesus. See, because Jesus is the one who came through the line of Abraham. The whole first chapter of Matthew is unpacking the genealogical line of Jesus, how Jesus came from Abraham and Isaac. Jesus is the one who said that I was there. Jesus said, I was there to see Satan shot out of heaven like a lightning bolt, speaking to his everlasting being. Jesus said he was there before Abraham. I am, Jesus said. Jesus goes ahead and says that he is the one who fulfilled the promise to bring forth salvation to the nations. Throughout his ministry, he talked about being a savior for the Jews and the Gentiles, referring to the nations. Jesus cared for all people, all nationalities, and opened the door for all people, and all nationalities becomes God's people. Even in his final moment, he told his leaders, go to the nations. And all of this connecting to Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 to 11. In Revelation chapter 7, 9 to 11, there's this moment where Jesus is being worshiped in Revelation. And the Apostle John sees this worship. And in the crowd, he says, there were people from all nations, all tribes, all languages. And he says something so significant. A number of people that can't be numbered. referring to the promise of the stars, of the grains of the sand, being so extravagant in size that no one can number. How many people are connected to God because of the blessing? And when you see that even deeper, that Jesus is the one foreshadowed in the story of Isaac and Abraham, that Jesus is the foreshadowed one that we see in that story. Think of it, the beloved son, born of an unlikely woman, born of a miracle, born to fulfill promise, hikes to the place of his sacrifice with the wood on his back alongside two servants. Who is that? That's Isaac, and that's Jesus. Jesus surrendered in obedience to the Father, even to his death. But unlike Isaac, Jesus wasn't spared. Isaac was spared, but Jesus wasn't. Because with Isaac, a ram was sacrificed instead. But even that ram is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Because there you have the supernatural sacrifice provided by God with his head caught in thorns, with a crown of thorns. So here we have Jesus, the beloved, miracle-born, promised child for the nations, sacrificed on the cross with a crown of thorns to bring peace to all who come to him. He didn't bring peace to one race. He didn't bring salvation to one kind of person, to the nations. And you see that nowhere else. And the truth of the scriptures is that Jesus, with his obedience, did the work to bring peace between God and man. And Jesus will return. He will return, and he will be obedient in his return to carry out the work that was failed in Numbers 33. He will be obedient in his return to remove all who don't belong. And this war was started because of Jesus, and Jesus will be the one who brings an end to it. And he will establish a city that we read in Hebrews, a heavenly country, the one where the foundations are designed and the builder is God. That's the story of Scripture, that when Jesus returns, he will be the one who brings the end to the war that no one else could bring an end to. And listen, I know when you read Revelation, you see how he does it. It's graphic, it's wild, and you're like, whoa, what's this? But this is where faith and trust comes in. It's because everything that he said would happen has happened. Everything the Bible has predicted has happened and continues to happen. So, what do we learn from this? Right? Like what do we do with all this? Like, in your minds, like, whoa, that was a lot of yelling. Whoa, I don't know what to do with all this. There's a lot going on. Did he spit? Yeah, he spit all over the place. I'm glad he had these things up here. Like, what do we do with all this? Like, what can we glean from this? Like, how do we watch the news and we see the tragedies and the dramaticness in the news constantly in Israel and the Middle East? What do we do with that? Well, there's a very valuable lesson in all of this. A very valuable principle that if you capture it, could dramatically transform your life and those who come after you. It's the idea of generational obedience. It's the idea of that you being obedient right now to God, you living as God has told you to, has impact and effects for those who come after you. The whole story of Abraham and Sarah, the whole story of the Israelites, the whole story, even all the way to Adam and Eve, was that they believed that their life was only about them, that there wasn't ramifications for those who come after them. And that's not true. The way you live your life now impacts your grandchildren, impacts those who come after you. I know some of you teenagers are like, bro, what? Yes. The way you live in obedience or disobedience has ramifications for those who come after you. And that's the choice you get to have. Will those who come after you be blessed or burdened because of you? Think of the lifestyles you choose. Think of the sexual lifestyles you choose. Think of the way you handle your marriage. Think of the way you handle your finances. Think of the way you handle yourself. Think of the life you live. Are you obedient or disobedient? It has ramifications beyond your life. And this is what we see when we look and we see the war over there. God was trying to prevent it this whole time. And if obedience had taken place, we would be in a very different world today. So church, may we be people who are obedient. May we obey even when things seem challenging and confusing. And when we obey, may we obey even like with Sarah, where things seem like they don't make sense. May we walk in faith and obedience. Let me close in prayer. God, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. Jesus, thank you for coming for us and loving us and caring and providing for us what we could never provide ourselves. Lord, I pray that in this sermon, in this topic, that we would all leave here with a greater awareness to the significance of what it means to obey you as we live this life. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.